Please join me in giving Robert Litan a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Thank you very much. I was wearing the same sport coat as John, and so just to differentiate myself, I'm gonna speak without a coat. Plus, it's unsufferably hot, which is a good transition to our topic today. The political season, I don't have to tell you, is heating up. And my topic today, I'm going to try to be somewhat dispassionate. I'm going to talk about what's happened to trade policy from the vantage point of both candidates, in fact, the country. And I'll try to stay away from the ad hominem attacks on both sides of the aisle right now that are dominating the airwaves, and try to stick to substance. And hopefully we'll have some time left over for Q&A. So let me begin. We're at a very odd moment in American history where the candidates of both political parties are not supporting more free trade deals. I don't have to tell you, obviously, where Donald Trump has been. He has risen largely on the strength of his threats to impose tariffs on China and Mexico, to renegotiate all our trade deals. Hillary Clinton has backed away from her support of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a deal with the Asian countries, and there is more of a milquetoast statement about trade policy in the Democratic platform. And then, of course, as you know, she ran against Bernie Sanders, whose trade position was virtually identical to Donald Trump's. So, in fact, I was looking over the political candidates, and I was trying to see if there were any free traders left. And of all the 17 candidates who ran for the presidential nomination, there was only one free trader. One. Do you know who it was? Any guesses? It was John Kasich. All right. Rubio started out that way, but sort of moved away from talking about free trade. And he was the only other one. So you had one candidate, and then we had no candidates in the Democratic Party. In fact, the only free traders who were left nationally talking are Speaker Ryan and the two vice presidential candidates. Mike Pence is historically a free trader, and so is Tim Kaine. That's it. By the way, there are other people who are for trade agreements and pro-trade in the Congress who are not running for national office, but those are the people left in national office. Now, before I try to predict in the future what lies ahead for trade policy, I want to step back historically and give you a context of where we've been over the last 100 years, just so you'll understand what a tremendous departure this represents from our history. And secondly, I want to try to explain why I think that departure's happened, and then we'll conclude with some forecasts. Okay. And finally, I should mention that as an economist, it will not surprise you that I am an ardent free trader. So I am deeply dismayed about what's going on in both parties and in the country. So a little history. The United States historically has not been on the side of free trade. When we started out as a republic, you know, there's a well-known play now in New York called Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was for the, quote, tariff, because before we had an income tax, the main source of revenue of the federal government was tariff revenue. And Alexander Hamilton wanted tariffs to protect the so-called infant industries in the United States. And that was the position of Alexander Hamilton. It was also the position of Abraham Lincoln, who financed the Civil War on the northern side through a 40 to 45% tariff on imported goods. Ironically, it was the South that was much more free trade. In fact, its trade with the United Kingdom, the South financed a lot of its activity by selling cotton that was, of course, picked by slaves. And they sold cotton to whom? The United Kingdom. And who did the United Kingdom side with during the Civil War? The South. So it's ironic that the South was more pro-free trade. Another irony that people forget is that Andrew Jackson, a very he would be the Bernie Sanders of today. Andrew Jackson was very pro-free trade. I mean, he opposed banks, and in that sense, he was very like Bernie Sanders. but he was very much for free trade because he was for farmers. And American farmers wanted free trade then, as they do now. And I don't have to tell you that free trade is in the interest of Kansas, because the more we can reduce agricultural barriers abroad, the more we can sell and the higher prices we will reap. So trade is good for Kansas. By the way, not just for agriculture, but for our other large export, which of course is airplanes. So just for the record, Kansas has a very strong interest in free trade. So back to the history. So it really wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that the United States moved more in the direction of a free trade policy. And after World War I, one of Wilson's 14 points in his so-called 14-point plan after World War I was to promote free trade. And we started dropping barriers against trade with respect to other countries until 1928. There was a famous act that was passed in 1928. Do people remember what it was called? It was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. All right? The Smoot-Hawley Tariff has since been blamed by most economists and historians, either for launching the Great Depression or certainly for making it much worse. And so by the time the Depression was in its depths, when unemployment was about 25%, Franklin Roosevelt finally started to negotiate what we would call the reciprocal undoing of Smoot-Hawley. In other words, for countries that were willing to drop their barriers, we expressed a willingness to drop our barriers, but only on a reciprocal basis. And it wasn't until after the end of World War II that President Truman, and I think there was a bipartisan consensus across both Republicans and Democrats, that we had to undo Smoot-Hawley. And if we were going to be the leaders of the free world, the way we were in particular going to fight communism was to promote free trade. And so we started to reduce barriers, but not on a reciprocal basis, but on a multilateral basis, under something called the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. Now, in 1948, when the GATT was negotiated, it was envisioned that there would be a centralized body that would determine, the body being called the GATT, that the centralized body would determine who was violating the rules that were being negotiated. The Congress rejected approval of this international organization, GATT, on the theory that this would surrender U.S. sovereignty. This is a theme that is going to come back. I'm going to talk about it in a minute. So even though we never formally approved the creation of an international body, we did authorize a series of multilateral trade negotiations over the next several decades that lowered tariffs throughout the world. We also did regional deals. NAFTA, of course, is the most famous. But we've done a lot of bilateral deals with countries like Israel, with Jordan, with Singapore, with Peru, with Colombia, and so on. There are a lot of bilateral deals. So if you add it all up, America is committed by treaty and through these agreements over the course of, 60 years to freer and freer trade. Now, this happens to coincide with what economists have been telling politicians to do, dating back to 1775, 76. That was when, ironically, our nation was formed. The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith was produced in 1776. And Adam Smith was an ardent free trader. And the theory behind free trade in Adam Smith's book, for those of you who may recall your economics, is there was something called the division of labor. That it made a lot more sense and you could produce a lot more if in any factory you divided up the task by people who were specialized in individual tasks. And rather than have one person make everything, it would be more productive to actually have a division of labor. That was the foundation of modern economics. It's a great insight. I can guarantee you if you or any one of us had to make our own clothing and grow our own food, we would all be a lot poorer than the nation that we have today where everybody is specialized. And we have a massive division of labor. Not only within the nation, we have a division of labor around the world, where essentially, and I'm grossly overgeneralizing here, the United States primarily has a skilled labor country, and we have an advantage, an absolute advantage, in producing goods that require skill and R&D and smarts. And countries that don't have the smarts and don't have the skilled labor, lower skilled labor. They tend to be the poorer countries of the world. And so they produce the more routine stuff. And that's basically the way the world has ended up being divided. Now, that's Adam Smith. There was another famous economist who came along about 4 decades later and enunciated the principle of comparative advantage. And that principle has been called by Paul Samuelson as probably one of the most important of all the principles in all of economics, because some people say that economics is nothing more than organized common sense, which is probably true, with the exception of the principle of comparative advantage, because it's counterintuitive. So I want to give you the following example. Suppose you have a country that has what's called an absolute advantage. It's better at producing everything than any other country. Does it make sense for that country to trade? And David Ricardo said yes, because every country has a comparative advantage in producing what it's really good at. And what it should do is make the stuff that it's really good at comparatively and trade for the stuff that relatively it's not as good at producing. And I try to illustrate this with the following example, and I draw it from the world of basketball because I'm a basketball fan. All right, imagine Michael Jordan, or today, Steph Curry or LeBron James. And let's just assume, for sake of argument, which is probably true, that these individuals are the best players in the world in basketball. All right? Let's also assume that if they mowed lawns, that they would be better than anybody else in the world. That's probably true too. All right? So they have an absolute advantage in playing basketball and in mowing lawns. Okay? Question: should they be mowing their lawn? No. They should be devoting all their time to playing basketball because there are only 24 hours in a day and they are making a gazillion bucks an hour in basketball. And what could they make mowing lawns? 20. All right? So it makes sense for LeBron and Steph and any other basketball player you name who's playing NBA basketball to be spending all their time practicing playing basketball and taking that money and then buying what other people produce. And what's true for LeBron and Steph Curry is true for all nations of the world. We are better off producing what we're good at. It's a fundamental principle. It's counterintuitive, but it happens to be true. So there was even an economist, a French economist named Frédéric Bastiat in the 19th century who said, it would even make sense for countries to trade if other countries were unfair in some manner. Because if we can get stuff cheaper than it costs to produce it at home, it still makes sense for us to buy the stuff that we can get cheaper and spend the rest of the money on other stuff, or spend the rest of our resources producing the stuff that we can sell abroad to other countries or consume at home. Now, as a practical matter, politicians in the United States have never endorsed, or very few of them have endorsed, what I would call unilateral free trade. They always talk about fair trade. But nonetheless, I give you this history to show that economists have been saying for 200 years or more that free trade is in the interest of nations because they'll all be wealthier if they trade. In fact, it was Greg Mankiw, who was George Bush's chief economic advisor, who said, and I quote, and I want to get the quote right, he said, quote, "Few propositions command as much consensus among professional economists as that open world trade increases economic growth and raises living standards." You can get economists who can disagree on a lot of issues. You know, whether they're Keynesians or whether they're monetarists or whether we should have fiscal stimulus or not or whatever. You'll get a lot of disagreement among economists. If you put all the economists I know in a room, I would tell you that 99 out of 100 would agree with the statement I just said. They all agree that free trade will maximize consumer welfare. So why is it then that we've had this huge backlash against free trade? Well, the assumption of the economists, the people who have negotiated our trade agreements and so forth over the last 60 years has been that economies are operated for the benefit of consumers. We don't operate economies for the benefit of firms or even their workers. It's consumer power or consumers that are the most important actors in the economy. because the producers will produce what we want. That's what a free market does. That's exactly what Adam Smith said. It's what David Ricardo said. It's what virtually all the economists in the world have written about this. Society should be organized to maximize the interests of consumers. What we've seen, though, in the last sort of few years, especially with this revolution against free trade, is people are saying, no, no, no. Producers count, and particularly firms, workers count as much as consumers. And if some people lose their jobs as we move resources into those firms in which we have a comparative advantage, then maybe we ought to rethink our position. All right? There's a quote by a former free trader, Republican Susan Collins, who was a senator from Maine, who gave you the following quote: "All the consumer benefits you get from freer trade don't help workers who lose their jobs." That in a nutshell explains, I think, why we have so much opposition. And the standard view now as to why the electorate has turned against free trade is that since the Great Recession, we've had the slowest recovery of any recovery since World War II. And people are fed up after 7 or 8 years. And even though we have an unemployment rate of 4.7%, which is historically very low, we have many workers who are underemployed. People are not, and because the recovery has been so slow, we have a middle class that basically is earning no more on average than it was 15 years ago. And people are very angry and very frustrated. That's the conventional wisdom, and I will certainly accept the conventional wisdom. That's certainly one reason for the hostility to freer trade. I want to give you 2 others that you will not see in the popular media, which I think are equally important. The second reason is that as we've had all these free trade deals, we've had something called diminishing returns to freer trade deals. Because when tariffs were 50%, as they were on average after World War II, and now let's say on average they're 5%, there isn't much left to liberalize. And the stuff that there is left to liberalize makes people very nervous. Because what the Japan trade or the Asian Pacific trade deal is about, and there is another agreement that's being negotiated with Europe along the same lines, it's to harmonize regulatory differences among countries that impede trade. And what's happened is that we've had a revolt from both the right and the left, interestingly, against these additional trade agreements that seem to invade national sovereignty. So it's one thing to say, let's get rid of tariffs, which are clear at the border restrictions. It's quite another to say, Europe and America ought to have the same rules for our industries, or for Asia and America to have the same rules. And if there are different rules, then we'll have a body called the World Trade Organization decide whether something is fair or not fair. And so the right and the left have become increasingly angry, in my view, and increasingly upset about the threat to our national sovereignty of having some third party decide what's fair and not fair. And I think that's an equally important driving factor behind the opposition to freer trade. So where do we go from here? I first want to take Trump. So the first thing to say about Trump is that the truthful answer is on trade, it's that it really is impossible to know what he would do. We know what he's threatened to do, all right? He's threatened high tariffs against China and Mexico. We know that, all right? He's threatened to rip up all our trade deals and renegotiate them, all right? Do we know that he actually would do that? By the way, I want to tell you that he would have the authority, in my opinion, if he wanted to unilaterally impose a large tariff on China or impose a large tariff on Mexico. There are provisions in U.S. trade law that allow a president unilaterally to do this. Now, Congress could always override him. I don't think they would, all right? Now, can he rip up trade agreements and simply say the United States is not going to live up to all those deals I told you about in my historical run-through? You know, the GATT deals, the NAFTA, the bilateral deals, and so forth. Can we unilaterally walk away from those deals? In theory, yes. But also, if we walk away from those deals, then obviously the countries on the other side of those deals have the right to walk away from them too. And that's why, if Trump pursues this kind of policy, a lot of people, including me, are worried that he would lead us back into a worldwide trade war. I can't tell you it will happen, but I personally get very worried about that. The second thing I want to take up is, let's suppose that Donald Trump actually carries through with all these threats, and that we impose higher tariffs on China and Mexico in particular. What would happen next? What would happen is that a lot of firms that are now in China and Mexico, what would they do? They'd move to other countries. They would move to Vietnam or the Philippines or any other low-wage country you pick, and instead we'd be importing from those countries. Now, if Donald Trump is carrying through with the rhetoric that he's talked about, it wouldn't then surprise me, he would say, well, then let's put tariffs on those countries, because they're evading, these firms are now evading the countries that I'm intending to punish. Once we do that, once we start saying we're now not going to import from all other low-wage countries, I really do believe at that point the world is in a trade war, all right? And at that point, I think, or well before that point, I think we would have a major stock market meltdown, because we're talking about a significant slowing of global growth. By the way, I think on the day after Donald Trump were to become president, if that happens, I don't think the market would fall apart, because I think most investors don't believe any of this will happen. But the closer it does come to happening, people will remember Smoot-Hawley of 1928. They will remember the Great Depression. The world is already growing very, very slowly, the world economy. The last thing we need is raising trade barriers around the world that will impede trade between countries. Now, what about Secretary Clinton? What if she becomes president? Well, she hasn't threatened anybody. All she has said is that we're going to walk away from TTP. And then, as I said, there is this milquetoast provision in the Democratic platform that says that we're only to negotiate future trade agreements with countries that protect our workers and that protect the environment, which is sort of pablum, to be honest with you. So I interpret a Clinton administration, especially because Clinton needs the so-called Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. I think a Clinton administration would basically be a do-nothing administration on trade. There'd be no new trade deals, but the major difference would be is at least we wouldn't be moving backward. I don't think there'd be a threat of a trade war in a Clinton administration. It just wouldn't be that there just wouldn't be any more trade deals. It's not the end of the world, but on the other hand, it is inconsistent with the march of history over the last 60 or 70 years. It would be a departure. Now, I want to conclude with some final thoughts. Suppose I could be king for a day. What would I do? Here's what I think the national policy ought to be. We spend much too much time obsessing over job loss due to trade. The overwhelmingly dominant force as to why people lose their jobs, any specific job, is the march of technology. It's robots, it's automation, it's computer software, it's artificial intelligence, etc. All of that, which is making it more efficient to produce. In fact, if you go out to Spirit or go out to any other aircraft manufacturer out here in Wichita, all right, I'll bet you they're producing very close to the same number of planes that they were producing 4 or 5 years ago, but they're doing it with fewer people. And if you go look at the national statistics, you'll find out that as a share of our overall GDP, manufacturing output is about the same share of what it was 20 or 30 years ago. We just need 1/3 or 2/3 fewer people to produce it, because of the same thing that happened with agriculture. Back in the day, in the early 20th century, 60% of Americans were employed on the farm. The percentage today is 2%. We produce a lot more stuff out of farms today than we did in 1900, but with 1/30 of the people. Why? Because of machines, modern farming, all this other stuff. So the same thing is happening in manufacturing. We just need a lot fewer people to produce the same amount of stuff. And this compares, by the way, when you worry about job loss, At the same time, a lot of people are gaining jobs. They're working in service industries, medical, education, and all other kinds of service industries, to the point that explains why our unemployment rate now is so low. It's 4.7%. It's pretty much back to where it was before the recession began. So it's technology that's driving this. And whether Donald Trump is president or Secretary Clinton is president, this isn't going to change. All right? They're not going to change this fact. So what I think we ought to do as a nation is that we ought to express both for moral and economic reasons, we have to do a much better job at helping people who are displaced, not just by trade, which really is a small part of the problem, but really by technology. People who are displaced need to be retrained, and they need to move to other industries. Now, in some cities, like Detroit, people have already moved. Detroit is somewhat of a ghost town, although it's coming back a little bit. But cities where there are no jobs experience population outmigration. And today, Detroit has 700,000 people. 20, 30 years ago, it had 2 million people. Where did all those people go? They went to Texas, all right? Seriously. Or they went to the Southwest where there are jobs. There are states in this country where the unemployment rate is 3 or 4%. And that's where the people moved. They moved to the jobs. Now, I think national policy ought to help people make that transition. And there are two proposals that I vigorously support. I'll be coming out with an article on both of them in some specialized journals. If you want to read them, I'd be happy to tell you about them later. One is an idea called wage insurance. I've written about it for 30 years. There are a number of other economists who have endorsed it. President Obama endorsed the idea in one sentence in the State of the Union last year. There have been Republicans who have endorsed the idea, and the idea is very simple. You lose your job for any reason, not just trade, technology. You don't have to prove the reason you lose your job. Let's say you lose your job and you were making $50,000 before, and then you go to a new job and you make $40,000. So you've lost $10,000. I would have the federal government make up 50% of that wage difference for 2 years from the date you got the job. That's very important. Because what that says is you don't sit home and wait for the next job and collect unemployment insurance. Because every day you stay home is a day you lose wage insurance. This gives you very strong incentives to go back to another job, even if you have to take a wage cut. Because the government will at least be supporting half of your wage difference. Now, I don't want to support the whole thing because that gives rise to what economists call moral hazard. I don't want to do that. But the government should share in the loss and cushion your downfall. You can view this cushion, this insurance, also as a training subsidy, because the firm that hires you, in effect, is getting paid to retrain you because it's paying you $40,000 rather than $50,000 what you were earning before. And this is a way to encourage people to get to move to firms or even move to cities where there are jobs, even if they have to start over and start climbing the ladder again. I want to make it easier to climb that ladder back to success. That's proposal number one. Proposal number two. What happens if you want to switch careers? Let's say you used to be in you were in aircraft manufacturing, and you don't want to go work at McDonald's and take a $30,000 pay cut and have the government pay half the difference. And you don't want to do that because there's no long-run future in McDonald's. All right, but you decide you want to go back and learn how to repair air conditioners or repair cars. Now that's going to require you're going back to school. All right, community college or some certified program. Who's going to pay for that if you don't have any money? I think everybody in the country ought to have a universal retraining account, loan account. Not free, not what Bernie tells you, what is just free, because I don't believe in free lunches. I'm an economist. I don't believe in free lunches. I think there ought to be a loan account, and you ought to be able to borrow money and go back and get retrained to another career. And here's the key. Rather than being tied to a specific interest rate and a specific loan repayment schedule, as you are now with student loans, because a lot of students have defaulted on their loans and they can't pay them back, I would have your repayment be income contingent. In other words, it would depend on your income in the future. So if you went back, became an air conditioner repairman, and you end up earning more money, then the amount of money that you pay is based on your income. It would just be figured into your income tax. And if you weren't successful, you just wouldn't pay it back. And essentially, America would get paid back by people going back to work and having new careers. So that's where I end up, and I think that's a humane policy. It's also a sensible policy. It happens not to be the sensible policy proposal of any of our candidates who are running for President of the United States. I will conclude with one final depressing thought. And that is that you can hear all the campaign rhetoric you want, but I want you to read, if you haven't read a book, there's one important book that I think explains more of what's going on in the U.S. economy than anything in the last 2 or 3 years. And the last time I was here at the club, about 2 years ago, I mentioned this book. It's written by an economist named Tyler Cowen, C-O-W-E-N, and the book is called Average is Over. And the elevator pitch on the book is this, is that what's happened in America is that we've become a 20-80 society. There are 20% of the people at the top. I'm not talking about the top 1% now. I'm talking about the top 20%. If you look at the top 20%, they've done very well. And the bottom 80% haven't. And to grossly overgeneralize, the people in the top 20% are people who are very comfortable with information technology. They're good with computers. They can use computers. They know how to either program them or they know how to use applications. And if you look at jobs in our economy, people who are very good with IT have experienced very rapid wage gains. The people who aren't so good with the IT are falling behind. And they're the people that are working to, whether to clean the clothes or serve the food or whatever, they're the people at the bottom who are helping the people at the top 20. And America, and essentially our political system, is wrestling with this huge problem of how to deal and help the people, how to help the 80% get into the top 20%, or better yet, broaden the top 20, so instead of 20, it's 30 or 40 or 50%. And the reason we've had this problem is that manufacturing, what I told you about, those increasing productivity improvements, manufacturing jobs, like the old jobs where you could go to Boeing and Spirit or whatever, and go out of high school and not go to college and make $50,000 or $60,000 a year, those jobs are gone. They're not coming back. They're never coming back, all right? And so as a result, our assembly line economy is gone. And the jobs that came with it, that guarantee you a middle class life, they're gone. And so that's why in this very high-tech economy, people with high-tech skills are pulling away from everybody else. And frankly, nobody has a very good answer for how to solve that problem. I gave you wage insurance and I gave you lifetime, lifetime lending to help you retrain for other jobs, whether it's repair person jobs or nursing jobs or whatever. Those jobs will help solve the 80-20 problem. They won't cure it. And I think until this problem, until this 80-20 situation is rectified or mollified in some way, we're still going to see the anger that we see that's right now driving the electorate. I thank you very much and happy to take your questions.
I'll be walking with the microphone if you'll
Yep.
just follow me.
These trade agreements that we have are very lengthy and wordy and very detailed and complicated. I think it was Murray Rothbard, at least he said, you don't need a treaty in order to have free trade.
Right.
Is that oversimplified and naive, or is there a lot of truth in that?
I think there's a lot of truth in it. Remember the economist I told you about, Frédéric Bastiat from France. 19th century, Murray Rothbard is just repeating what Frédéric Bastiat had said 100 years before. I mean, what Bastiat basically said is forget trade agreements. Let's just drop all of our barriers, period. And let's just import the cheapest thing regardless. But politically, we've not been able to do that because people will lose their jobs in the process, and we have this transition. How do you handle those people who have lost their jobs? And so as a result, politically, we haven't implemented it. But from a strictly economic point of view, I couldn't agree with it more.
Right here with John.
We talked about wage insurance.
Yeah.
Could that be something that's handled by the private sector? Because I've had it before.
Yeah.
And the second question, when Ross Perot ran for president, he talked about how we should be working towards building computer chips instead of manufacturing potato chips.
Right.
And it kind of touches on that. And then we have the educational system that allows us to do the computer chips versus potato chips.
Okay, so why can't wage insurance be done by the private sector? For the same reason that unemployment insurance is not done by the private sector. It's because of what we would call the adverse selection problem. All right? Because if it were only available privately, the only people who would sign up would be the people who would be most likely to lose their jobs. They know it. All right? It's the same problem as in medical insurance. Whereas in a market without any kind of safety net for people at the bottom, and I'm not saying here you have to have Obamacare or anything like that, but without some kind of government as a safety net, you get what's called adverse selection. Only the riskiest people will sign up for the insurance. And if that's true, it drives up the premiums to the point where then people who aren't sick, who are, let's say, in the job market, who are less likely to be unemployed, they won't buy the insurance because it'll be too expensive. That's why you need the government. That's why we have the government do unemployment insurance. So it's the same principle. Now, I think your question about computer chips versus silicon it's computer chips versus potato chips. In a way, even that statement's outdated, because the chips themselves are really probably the number of people or whatever. They're a small part of what's going on in the IT economy. The IT economy is driven overwhelmingly by software. All right, it's the people writing code. So we are in what I would call the code economy. And there are hand-wringers out there who are worried that eventually we're going to have computers even writing the code and we won't even need the people to do that. All right? And I would say the simplified code, that's true, because already computers are capable of doing that. But you're still going to need humans to design those software programs that will be writing code. And even for those jobs, even in that world, the people, for example, that worry about the disappearance of manufacturing, there are some people, for example, who are worried about the disappearance of work. I'm not worried about it, all right? Because as things made with chips get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, think about TVs. They're just unbelievable. They've fallen in price. Anything with chips in it has fallen in price. What happens is that we take that extra savings of money and we spend it on other stuff, like leisure, like going to the movies, like entertainment. Why do you think our people are spending so much money on, cable TV, et cetera? That didn't happen 20, 25 years ago. It's because other stuff gets cheaper and we redeploy and we spend money on other things. I'm not worried about it. And even in this world in which people, as I said, are obsessed about technology and losing jobs, the unemployment rate continues to fall. In fact, today, I just read on the internet on the way here, we had another 255,000 jobs last month. The economy is still continuing to generate jobs. The reason why people are upset is that the jobs that are being generated are not high-wage jobs. That's what people are worried about. They're not jobs, they're worried about wages, all right? And wages in the end, I'm sorry to go on so long, but I have to tell you this, wages in the end are driven by productivity. And if the economy can become more productive, then workers are more productive and they'll get paid more, all right? And the problem that we've had since the last 2008 is that our productivity improvement has been relatively slow. Despite all this automation, we've had the slowest growth in productivity probably in the last 8 years that we've had in probably the last 30 years. That is a problem. And that is a problem that I argue, and you haven't heard anything about that in the presidential campaign. It's because you can't reduce it to a soundbite. But that's what drives the economy. Yes.
Yes, I heard an Apple executive say that if the iPhone was made in the United States, it would cost well over $2,000 for a phone.
Right.
And he also said that Americans aren't genetically programmed to do the type of work to make an iPhone. And he said that if you go to these factories in China, you'll see thousands of people sitting at a desk with a microscope in front of them, doing one thing and handing it to another. It's very intricate. They work 10, 12 hours a day to make the iPhone that costs $600 here.
Right.
Now, the point I'm asking you is, are certain ethnic groups more genetically programmed to make certain products? Are they better at making those products than we? Can we do that in the United States? Are we not that diligent to sit at a desk for 8 hours a day and make those products?
Okay, a tough question. So the short answer is, of course Americans could do that work. Of course they could. So I'm not going to get into the comparison. I mean, the fact of the matter is Apple has outsourced those jobs because wage rates are obviously lower in other countries. But the quote about the $2,000 I'm not going to tell you whether it's exactly right, but I can guarantee you the iPhone would be a hell of a lot more expensive if you had to make all parts of it in the United States. I read somewhere, I think the iPhone, of which I'm carrying one, there are parts made in 30 different countries. All right? And that's another important point to talk about trade agreements. We have a president who rips up all of our trade agreements. We're talking about ripping up all the trade agreements that affect all the stuff that goes into this phone. All right? And I can guarantee you that if we rip up those trade agreements, this phone is going to cost a hell of a lot more than $600. All right? And multiply that by the millions of iPhones that are sold every year. That's right. And then we're talking about a lot of extra money then going into iPhones that, and this is what is not mentioned, that's money that can't be spent on other things, all right? Like airplane travel or buying food or other things. And when you can't spend money on other things, you have job losses. So that's why, for example, I didn't mention on my main talk, let's say, for example, you put on tariffs on steel, all right? And the problem is there are something like 150, 200,000 people working in the steel industry, but there are like 12 million people who work in industries that use steel. So that when you put a tariff on steel, you're affecting 12 million people, not the 200 or 300,000 people who may be directly affected. So at the end of the day, I think it all comes out in the wash. And what trade restrictions do is they move jobs around. They make things more expensive that are obviously the subject of trade restrictions. But at the end of the day, we're all worse off for it because we're paying more for our stuff than we would otherwise.
So the wage insurance, are you proposing that would replace unemployment insurance?
No, I would keep it alongside, but, and here's the critical thing, it would reduce the cost of unemployment insurance. Because, see, people getting wage insurance would be getting jobs more quickly, and they wouldn't need the UI. So UI costs would go down, which would be a savings. And overall, the Congressional Budget Office has estimated what the wage insurance program I outlined talked about. And it would cost roughly $3 billion a year nationally, which is not a lot of money. It's pretty trivial.
You mentioned the possibility with increased tariffs that the stock market could collapse. What do you see as a good alternative investment for the stock market today?
Oh my God. Oh, you want investment advice from me. So okay, I'm only going to give you one tip. All right, and I'm stealing it from somebody else because anybody who's any good steals good ideas from somebody else. Because I worry about this. Look, I'm 66. I'm worried, and that people in my generation, we're all, we're getting screwed. We're lucky if we can get 1%. All right, and T-bills, the T-bill rate on 10 years is like 2% or less. Excuse me, it's like 1.5%. And 30 years is like 2.5. So can you do any better? So I'm going to give you one suggestion. So there was a column in the Wall Street Journal written by a very famous economist at Princeton named Burton Malkiel. He wrote a book called The Random Walk Down Wall Street. It's the best-selling book about the stock market in American history. Random Walk Down Wall Street. It's written. Don't buy the book. I'm going to tell you the bottom line. All right. It's in its 13th edition. All right. There are two things in that book. Only one thing in that book. It says, if you're going to be in the stock market, buy an index fund, all right? Because it's cheaper and don't screw around with actively managed funds. That's sort of one piece of advice. But secondly, if you're worried about the fluctuations in the stock market, you're worried about the stock market being too high, et cetera, as I think I am. I worry about it daily. And you need yield. He suggested an ETF that invests in preferred stock because they have high dividends. They're taxed at the dividend rate, not at the ordinary income rate for ordinary income taxes. So the dividend rate is about 23% versus the top rate on ordinary income, which is, about 40 plus, okay? And the preferred stock is paying, the preferred stock ETF, and I'm going to give you its symbol right now. I think it's, because I bought a lot of it. It's PFF. And it's an iShare preferred stock. And PFF is paying about 5.6%. Now, this is not guaranteed, but the point of the preferred stock is, as you know, preferred has a preference over common. It's going to fluctuate less than common, And even if long-term interest rates go up, it's probably less likely to fall than bonds. Bonds are really going to go down if long-term rates go up. But at least since there's an equity component, it's probably going to be less affected than long-term bonds. So for what it's worth, that's my stock tip of the day. All right? Huh?
What was the first recommendation you made?
Oh, if you're going to be in the stock market, buy index fund. And whether it's an S&P 500 index fund, or there are a lot of index funds out there, but just don't pay for actively managed. Just go to Vanguard or Fidelity and buy an index fund. You know. And by the way, the other advice that people tell you is never put all your money in all at once. Put it in gradually. You know, if you've got money. Now, everything depends on your age. All right. So you know, people my age, I'm 66. I mean, I've gotten, over the years, I've gotten out of the stock market. I can't stand it, you know. It makes me, I mean, the fluctuations. And by the way, this is what economic or financial advice tells you. As you get older, you should have less of your portfolio in stocks and more in fixed income. The problem is in fixed income, you're getting nothing for it, what we just talked about. And in particular, if you're in long-term fixed income, when long-term interest rates rise, as they inevitably will, you're going to lose a lot of money. So that's why I put money into preferred stock. That's one example. Another thing, if you want to minimize your risk, I do have a substantial portion of my portfolio in sort of medium-term bonds. Bonds that are like 5 to 7 year maturity. I'm only getting 1 and 1.5% on them now. But you know what? I'm not going to lose my money. All right? And
would it be possible for me to turn your attention to a different dimension of your economic?
Yes, it is. In any event. But people are most concerned about this, I know. Over here.
To what extent do you feel that the government has played a role in both a plus and a minus in the lack of productivity, et cetera, in our economy?
That's a great question, because productivity is job number one, right? So just to give you first some statistics, the average productivity increase, this is now output per unit of labor input, was historically between 48 and 73 was over 3% a year. Then 73 to roughly 92, 93, it fell to about 1.5% a year. In the 90s, I hate to say it in a Republican crowd, but during the Clinton years, it went back up to 3%. And even in the Bush years, it was like in the 2.5% range. Since 2008, productivity improvements have been averaging about 1% a year.
Was Clinton, when
Okay.
he brought along, was he not the
Huh?
contract with Americans when it really came?
Well, who the hell knows? I mean, 1990 was, I mean, Clinton takes credit for it, but it's hard, I think it's not correct. But we had a budget deal, but the budget deal, I would say, did not have a direct impact on the productivity of of the workforce. What really had is that that was the age in which the internet took off. That was the age in which computerization took off. And Silicon Valley went crazy, the internet boom, et cetera. And we had a massive improvement or replacement of people by machines and software in the 1990s.
Inherent in my question
Yes.
is the fact that the more government, and you alluded to that,
Yes.
we need another government program. We are consuming more with government, and government has proven to be very inefficient as opposed to free trade. Consequently, the answer seems to be, in many cases, more government.
Okay, so.
To be counterproductive to free trade.
Okay, so now I honestly think the level of involvement, the level of spending in an economy, and whether or not we have free trade are two completely separate issues. All right, I think the more free trade we have, the more productive we're likely to have, the more productive we're likely to be, because we're going to be basically the cost of making things will go down. All right, so free trade is very much linked with productivity. All right, so if you want faster productivity, you certainly want more free trade. That's point one. All right. Point two is you probably want less regulation. All right.
A Friedman approach?
Well, Friedman, there are a lot of people who have argued for less regulation. All right. And I, in particular, would focus, if I had to make any distinction, I would have sort of less regulation for newer companies in particular. Companies are less than 5 years old. Because if you look historically at what drives productivity improvements, it's really those new companies. It's the companies that have no vested interest in the status quo. And I've written a lot of other stuff. I've written a couple of books One in particular I can recommend to you called Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism, which describes in great detail how new companies historically have brought forth the major innovations in our economy that have driven productivity growth. So anything that's good for entrepreneurship, in my view, is good for productivity growth. And that brings me, I want to do one final point, because I know we got one more question. If you want one other thing that's really good for new business formation, especially high-tech business, you ought to be for high-skilled immigration. You want as many smart people coming to this country as possible because they disproportionately start new businesses and they disproportionately start high-tech businesses. And high-tech businesses drive productivity growth. And that's another thing that's been very disappointing to me about at least some candidates who have been talking about restricting immigration. You can talk about low-skilled immigration, that's a whole separate issue, but at a minimum we ought to be letting in high-skilled immigrants. In fact, I would have a very, very liberal policy about that. Yes?
I think we have time for one more. I'm so sorry for
Yeah.
those of you that I didn't get to.
Recently, I heard a conversation where the comment was made that in regards to job development, that we in America actually aren't educating people to the jobs that are there.
Right.
Do you agree with that disconnect, and what should we do about it if there is that disconnect?
Well, yeah, there have been a lot of corporate execs who've been bemoaning the fact that they have unfilled openings for people, and they don't have the skilled workers to find them. And in particular, as our economy ages, the people with the skills, like your husband, all right? This woman who I was having lunch with, her husband is a mechanic at Spirit. I assume he's a very experienced, very skilled worker, all right? He's going to be retiring in a couple of years, all right? Spirit's going to have a hard time replacing him, all right? And it's not just him, it's a whole cohort of workers. If you go to electric utilities, they'll tell you the same thing. We have a major problem in this country of replacing skilled workers. So if you're a company, what do? You either invest in machines to try to replace the people, or you invest in training, and hopefully somebody does the training so you have these skilled workers. That's why, and I'm going to put in a plug for Wichita State here, Wichita State wants to merge with WATC. WATC is training people for jobs of the future. They're training those repairmen. They're training the skilled workers that can go work at Spirit or any of the other manufacturing plants, all right? And they're also allowing them to get on a path where they can get a college degree at the same time if they choose to. That's why that merger is so important for Wichita State. It's important for our community, and that's a model for the country. We need program. And my proposal, for example, of a universal loan account that would allow people to retrain, it would be designed to facilitate that. We need more skilled workers to replace the people who are retiring, or whether it's not retiring, just unfilled jobs out there that firms can't find anybody to fill. And it is a problem.
Robert Litan, let's give him a standing thank you.